my player class doesn't really do anything other than set up the player and then allow you to get back a customized printout of that player's information. There are some things we're going to want to do that are pretty basic. Things like using a patience pack, for example, or even poking another player. So let's take a look at how we might be able to build some of those methods. So if we have a use patience pack method, and I'll comment this method so you'll understand what we'd like it to do. Now remember, you really should comment all of your methods. If you do a slash followed by 2 stars in NetBeans and hit enter, it will automatically provide you with an area to type some comments. And if there is a return value other than void, and if there's some parameters inside here, it'll customize this and make it easy for you to explain those. But I'll just type the basic logic in here. We want to give this player somewhere between 10 to 50 patience points. So the first thing we need to do is check if the player actually even has a patience pack. So if get patience packs is greater than 0, then I'm going to want to change this player's patience by, again, some random amount. So I'm going to set the player's patience. Now this is where it gets a little bit tricky. I don't know what this value is in here yet. So what I do know is I'm going to add whatever this new value is to the existing value that the player has for their patience. So I want to start off with the player's current patience, and I want to add to it a certain amount. So in this case, that amount is going to be some random value. Now, in this method, I don't have a random number generator, so I'm going to need to create one. And so it's going to be increased by some random value, and from 10 to 50 is going to be 41 options. So that should give me a number from 0 to 40, and then I want to add 10 to it. So that should give me a random number. This expression here should give me a random number from 10 to 50, because this will give me a random number from 0 to 40, and I'm going to add 10 to it. So basically what I'm saying is always add 10 to the current patience and then chuck on a random amount from 0 to 40 on top of that. Now, if we do actually use their patience pack, we need to make sure that we decrease, or the geeky term for it would be decrement, the number of patience packs they have. So I'm going to set it to whatever they currently have now, -1. If this is not true, if they don't have any patience packs, nothing's going to happen. Okay, they're not going to get any benefit. So let's test this out. And see what happens if I use a patience pack. I should see 2 different outputs. So you can see I start out with 56 patience and 2 patience packs, and then I use one, I get up to 97. That's pretty good. 41 bonus, not bad. And I now only have 1 patience pack. Now, watch what happens if I try to do this too many times. And you'll see the results. Okay, so when I started out, I had 3 patience packs. I used one, got up to 106. I used another one, got up to 148. Used another one, got up to 166 patience. And then for all the remaining times, you can see nothing changed. I called the use patience pack method, but nothing was altered. Okay. So now we know that the use patience pack method is working. Now the next thing we might want to do is figure out how do we poke somebody. So we want to think about what is the purpose of this method where we're going to poke somebody. Well, you're going to want to poke another player, and your poke should have some kind of impact on that other player. So that means that when you choose to poke somebody, the poke method is going to need to know which player are you trying to poke. So that means that you need to pass in as a parameter the player that you want to poke. So let's create our poke method, and let's document this. So here you can see what I was talking about the auto documentation. So NetBeans is saying, well, I know there's a parameter for this method and it's called enemy. And so usually what you do is you put the type of the data next to it and then a description of it. So really all we're doing is we're going to take the enemy and we're going to set their patience equal to their current patience. Okay, now notice I'm using the enemy's set patience method and the enemy's get patience method because that's the player I want to deal with. Okay, so I'm going to get that player's patience and I want to set it to that value minus some random value from 5 to 25. So I'm going to need a random generator. And there are 21 different options from 5 to 25, and the minimum option is 5. I'm going to put brackets around this so there's no confusion. I don't want to subtract a random amount from get patience and then suddenly add 5 to it. So I'm going to put brackets around this so that I get a value and then subtract that total value from the enemy's patience. Now there's a minor problem here, and I don't know if you'll be able to spot what it is. Maybe we should play the game a little bit and see what happens. It would be nice to know how many points of damage you were doing. So instead of just putting it in here, maybe it would make more sense. And I guess I shouldn't say damage because again, violence is just so bad. I know you guys don't play any online shooting games or anything like that. So let's actually put so let's store the amount of points that you poke the person with into a variable called drain. And then what we'll do is we will just set the enemy's patience to their current patience minus drain. And just so that whatever part of the code calls this poke method understands how much damage was done, instead of this being a void, let's make this an int. And so we'll have this method not only do the poke, but it will also return how much damage was done. And I'll add that return value up here. Okay, I only have one player right now, but let's say I get into a poking battle with Mr. Pearson. What I'm going to do is run a method. So basically I'm going to try to keep poking Mr. Pearson until I win. So while the enemy's patience is greater than 0, I am going to poke, there's the method right there, I'm going to poke the enemy. And see, it knows what the other one is. It knows that there's really only one other player involved here, so it's smart enough to throw that object in there. Remember, this poke method not only actually drains the patience from the enemy, it returns a value too. So what I can do here is I can actually output all of this together in one line. Okay, so what this is going to do is it's going to print out that the poke drained a certain amount of patience, because this method is going to poke the enemy and it's also going to return back a value. So this method will do the poke and it will also turn into a value like 15 or 7 or however much damage was done. And what I'll do is after each poke, I'm going to print out the status of the enemy. So let's see how this goes. Okay, so I've got some formatting issues, but I can fix that later. So you can see I start to drain some patience. Mr. Pearson gets down to having 13 patience and 2 patience pack. I poke him and it drains 17 patience points, but he's still got 13, which is kind of weird. Well, then I poke him again for 8 and he goes down to 5. Well, that's good. Then I poke him again for 23 and his patience stays at 5. So you can see that I continue to poke for all these points and his patience stays at 5. It doesn't work until I do a poke that drains exactly 5 patience points. So let's take a look at why that is. If we look at the player, the set patience class will not allow you to set a patience that's less than 0. So when I do the poking up here, if this value winds up being less than 0, so if I'm draining more patience points than the enemy has, it will not actually do that. It won't set that enemy's patience to a value less than 0. So what I need to do is, instead of setting a negative value in here, I need to set it to 0 if the resulting patience is going to be 0 or less. So in other words, if I think of some scenarios, so run through a couple of possibilities. You could have negative, if you had -5 as the resulting patience, you actually want it to be 0. If you had -7, you want it to be 0. If it was 0, you want it to be 0. If it was 7, you want it to be 7, not 0. So basically, you want it to be the larger of whatever the resulting patience would be, or 0. So there's a method in Java called max. And what it does is it takes the maximum of 2 values. And so I would like to set the patience to the maximum of either what the current enemy's patience is when I drain them, or 0. So what this means is if this winds up being a negative number, then we'll just set their patience to 0. But if this value is greater than 0, this will be the one that's used. So let's see how that works. Okay, so Mr. Pearson starts out with 43. We drain for 21. We drain for 14. His patience goes down to 8. The poke drains 12 patience, and you can see that his patience gets set to 0. So that's a much more realistic way of doing this. So using this max method, we can make sure that a negative patience is never the value that we pass into the set patience method. It'd be a good idea to comment this a bit. Now, there's another way we could go about this. And I'm sort of walking through this as you might walk through it as you're thinking through this problem. So the question you have to ask is, do I always want to set my patience value to 0 if a user attempts to pass in a negative number? And if that's the case, then instead of having every time I try to set the patience do this calculation, the smarter thing to do would be to actually just adjust the set patience method. So let me go down to my set patience method. So if the patience is greater than or equal to 0, I can set that patience. But if it's not, that means a negative value was passed in. So maybe I should set the patience to 0 automatically and just say, if you've passed in a negative number, I'm just going to ignore it and I'm going to set it to 0. And since this comparison would set this to 0 as well. I'm just going to do that. So if patience is greater than 0, it's going to set it to whatever that patience is. If patience is 0 or less, we'll set the patience to 0. Now by doing that, it means that up here, I can make this much more simple. I can go right back to what I was doing before, and I don't have to, this poke method basically doesn't have to be so smart about being aware of the fact that set patience doesn't need, or that set patience won't use a negative number. And this is what we want to shoot for. You don't want to have to understand the inner workings of how these classes operate. We could document this set patience method so that people understood that you couldn't set a negative patience. But by letting the method take care of itself, we've managed to simplify this, and it means that anytime anybody else uses set patience and tries to pass in a negative number, it'll just be set to 0, which makes a lot of sense. So let's just test that that still works. There we go, and down here you can see when the patience is 9 and a poke drains for 18 patience points, it's 0. And I'm just going to go clean up this, I'm going to go clean up the main class so that this output looks a little bit better. Okay, there we go.